beneath the endless white expanse of Antarctica, something extraordinary might be waiting, something that could rewrite everything we thought we knew about human civilization. For decades, satellite images have captured strange geometric formations buried deep under miles of ice. Structures that some researchers claim aren't natural at all, but man-made, ancient, and deliberately hidden from the world. But here's what makes this story truly unsettling. Every time someone gets close to the truth, the evidence seems to vanish. Research permits get denied. Expeditions are quietly cancelled. Scientists who ask too many questions find their funding mysteriously cut. And the few satellite images that do leak to the public? They're dismissed as natural rock formations or explained away as optical illusions. Tonight, we're going to dig into what might be the most carefully guarded secret on Earth. We'll examine the satellite evidence that governments don't want you to see. We'll hear from the researchers who've risked their careers to speak out. And we'll explore why powerful institutions might have every reason to keep Antarctica's secrets buried under the ice forever. I've spent months investigating this story, cross-referencing declassified documents, analyzing satellite imagery, and speaking with sources who demanded anonymity. What I found isn't just a collection of strange rock formations. It's a pattern of systematic suppression that stretches from university research departments to international treaty organizations. A coordinated effort to ensure that certain discoveries never see the light of day. But before we dive into the evidence, let me ask you something. If ancient civilizations once existed in Antarctica, if there are structures down there that predate everything we know about human history, who benefits from keeping that information hidden? And more importantly, what are they so afraid we might discover? The story begins in 2012, when a routine geological survey captured something unexpected. Dr. Charles Hapgood, a respected cartographer, was analyzing topographical data from the Ellsworth Mountains when he noticed something that didn't belong. 3 distinct pyramid-shaped structures, each roughly 400 feet tall, arranged in a perfect triangular formation. The precision was unmistakable, too precise for nature. Hapgood knew immediately that he was looking at something significant. These weren't jagged mountain peaks worn down by wind and ice. They had clean, geometric lines, smooth faces that caught sunlight at angles that natural formations simply don't create. He documented everything meticulously, prepared detailed reports, and submitted his findings to the National Science Foundation. Then something strange happened. His research grant was terminated. His access to satellite data was revoked. And when he tried to publish his findings in academic journals, he was told the images were inconclusive, too blurry to draw meaningful conclusions. But Hapgood had seen the high-resolution versions. He knew what he was looking at. That's when he made a decision that would change everything. He leaked the images to independent researchers around the world. Within days, the story exploded across alternative media platforms. People were calling them the Pyramids of Antarctica, comparing them to the Great Pyramid of Giza, speculating about lost civilizations and ancient technologies. The response from official channels was swift and decisive. The images were fake, they said. Digital manipulations created by conspiracy theorists. The formations were nothing more than nunataks, natural rock outcroppings that appear pyramid-like when viewed from certain angles. Case closed. But here's what they didn't expect. Other researchers started looking, and they started finding more. Biologist from the University of Chile, Dr. Elena Vasquez, a GLAC, discovered what appeared to be a massive circular structure in the Transantarctic Mountains, nearly 2 miles in diameter, with concentric rings that suggested deliberate construction. When she tried to organize an expedition to investigate, Her proposal was rejected by the Antarctic Treaty System. Too environmentally sensitive, they said, too dangerous for research teams. Then there was the discovery that really got people's attention. In 2016, thermal imaging satellites detected unusual heat signatures beneath the ice in East Antarctica. Not the gradual warming you'd expect from geothermal activity, but distinct hotspots arranged in geometric patterns, as if something down there was generating heat in precise, organized locations. The official explanation? Volcanic activity. Natural geothermal vents that happen to form interesting patterns. But geologists pointed out a problem with that theory. The heat signatures didn't match any known volcanic formations. They were too regular, too symmetrical. And they appeared to be connected by what looked like underground corridors stretching for miles beneath the ice. Dr. Michael Harrison, a thermal imaging specialist who worked on the original analysis, later admitted in a private interview that the patterns defied natural explanation. He described structures that appeared to be interconnected, possibly forming a vast underground complex. But when he tried to publish his findings, his superiors at NASA intervened. The data was classified for national security reasons. National security. Think about that for a moment. What kind of national security threat could ancient ruins in Antarctica possibly pose? Unless, of course, they weren't just ruins. This is where the story takes an even stranger turn. Because it's not just individual researchers making these discoveries. Entire teams of scientists working independently across different countries and institutions have been finding similar anomalies, and they're all being silenced in remarkably similar ways. The pattern is always the same. A researcher discovers something unusual. They document it carefully, following proper scientific protocols. They submit their findings through official channels, and then the walls come down. Funding disappears. Data gets classified. Expeditions get cancelled. And anyone who tries to speak publicly about their discoveries finds themselves professionally isolated. It's a coordinated suppression campaign that spans multiple governments and international organizations. The kind of systematic cover-up that only happens when something truly significant is at stake. But what could be so important about ancient structures in Antarctica that it requires this level of secrecy? The answer might lie in what these structures could tell us about human history, and about technologies that we're supposedly only discovering today. Consider this. If there really are ancient pyramids and complex structures buried under the Antarctic ice, they would have been built when that region was ice-free. According to mainstream geology, Antarctica has been frozen for millions of years. But what if that timeline is wrong? What if Antarctica was habitable much more recently than we've been told? Some researchers point to evidence that the continent may have been ice-free as recently as 12,000 years ago, right around the time that many ancient civilizations around the world experienced a sudden leap in technological and architectural sophistication. The same period when massive stone structures started appearing globally, built with precision that challenges our understanding of ancient capabilities. If Antarctica was indeed ice-free during this period, it could have been home to an advanced civilization, one that developed technologies and knowledge that were later spread to other parts of the world as the continent froze and its inhabitants migrated to warmer regions. This isn't just wild speculation. There's growing evidence that ancient civilizations possessed knowledge and capabilities that mainstream archaeology has been reluctant to acknowledge. Precision stone cutting that rivals modern techniques. Astronomical knowledge that suggests sophisticated observation and calculation. Construction methods that we still can't fully explain. The Piri Reis map, created in 1513, shows the coastline of Antarctica with remarkable accuracy. But here's the problem. According to official history, Antarctica wasn't discovered until 1820. and the coastline depicted on the map shows the continent as it would appear without ice. How could a 16th century cartographer have access to such detailed knowledge of a continent that supposedly hadn't been discovered yet, much less surveyed? The map includes a note stating that it was compiled from older source materials, some dating back thousands of years. This suggests that ancient civilizations not only knew about Antarctica, but had detailed maps of its ice-free coastline, maps that somehow survived and were passed down through generations of cartographers. If this is true, then the idea of ancient structures in Antarctica isn't just possible, it's probable. And that's exactly the kind of information that could force us to completely rewrite human history. But there's another possibility that's even more disturbing. What if the structures in Antarctica aren't just ancient? What if some of them are still active? Remember those thermal signatures that NASA classified? The ones that showed organized heat patterns beneath the ice? What if they're not just remnants of an ancient civilization, but evidence of technology that's still functioning, still operating after thousands of years? This would explain the extreme secrecy surrounding Antarctic research. It would explain why certain areas are completely off-limits to civilian researchers. And it would explain why governments around the world have such a vested interest in controlling the narrative about what's really buried under all that ice. The implications are staggering. If there are functional ancient technologies in Antarctica, studying them could revolutionize our understanding of physics, engineering, and energy production. But it could also threaten existing power structures, industries built on current technologies, economic systems that depend on scarcity and controlled resources. The people who control global energy markets, who profit from our dependence on fossil fuels and limited technologies, would have every reason to keep revolutionary discoveries hidden, at least until they can figure out how to control and monetize them. This isn't just about archaeology anymore. This is about power, about who gets to control humanity's technological future, and about what lengths those in power will go to maintain their control over information that could change everything. The evidence keeps mounting, and the more you dig, the more obvious the cover-up becomes. In 2018, a team of Russian researchers, using ground-penetrating radar, made a discovery that should have made international headlines. Instead, their findings were buried so deep that most of the scientific community never even heard about them. Dr. Alexei Petrov and his team were conducting what they thought would be routine ice thickness measurements in Queen Maud Land. But their radar penetrated deeper than expected, revealing cavities and structures that defied explanation. Not random caves or natural formations, but organized spaces with regular geometric patterns extending hundreds of feet beneath the surface. Petrov's initial reports described what appeared to be rooms, corridors, and chambers arranged in a systematic layout. The radar signatures showed density variations consistent with constructed walls and open spaces. In some areas, the returns suggested metallic objects or materials with properties unlike anything in the natural geological record. But here's where it gets really interesting. When Petrov tried to organize a follow-up expedition with ground teams and drilling equipment, he hit a wall of bureaucracy that made no sense. His permits were delayed, then denied. His funding from the Russian Academy of Sciences was quietly redirected to other projects. And when he persisted in trying to publish his findings, he was informed that his research fell under military jurisdiction for ice thickness measurements. Petrov later confided to colleagues that he believed his team had discovered artificial structures of incredible complexity. Not just buildings, but what appeared to be an interconnected network of facilities spanning several square miles beneath the ice. The kind of underground installation that would require advanced engineering and massive resources to construct. When asked directly about the metallic signatures his equipment detected, Petrov became visibly uncomfortable. He would only say that the materials appeared to have properties that weren't consistent with any known metals or alloys, dense but structured in ways that suggested purposeful design rather than natural occurrence. The Russian discovery wasn't an isolated incident. Around the same time, ground teams from 3 different countries reported similar anomalies in separate regions of Antarctica. Each time, the pattern repeated. Initial excitement from researchers, followed by administrative interference, followed by complete silence. But perhaps the most compelling evidence comes from an unexpected source. Commercial satellite companies, the ones that provide imagery for Google Earth and other mapping services, have been quietly editing their Antarctic coverage for years. Not just blurring sensitive areas, but actually removing or altering images that show unusual formations. A group of independent researchers calling themselves the Antarctic Anomaly Project has been documenting these changes. They've identified dozens of instances where satellite images have been modified between updates. Geometric shapes that appeared in one version of the data simply vanish in the next. Unusual terrain features get smoothed over or replaced with generic ice textures. The most dramatic example occurred in 2019, when high-resolution imagery briefly showed what appeared to be the tip of a massive structure protruding through the ice in the Ellsworth Mountains. The formation was clearly artificial, with straight edges and right angles that nature simply doesn't produce. Within 72 hours, the image had been replaced with a version showing only smooth, undisturbed snow. Google initially claimed it was a processing error, a glitch in their imaging algorithms, but metadata analysis revealed that the replacement image was actually older than the original, suggesting that the corrected version had been deliberately substituted to remove the anomalous structure. This kind of systematic image manipulation requires coordination between multiple organizations. Satellite operators, government agencies, and tech companies all working together to maintain a consistent narrative about what Antarctica looks like from space. The resources and planning required for such an operation suggest that whatever they're hiding is considered extremely important. And it's not just visual evidence being suppressed. Seismic data from Antarctica shows patterns that don't match natural geological activity. Instead of the random vibrations you'd expect from ice movement and tectonic shifts, monitoring stations have detected regular, rhythmic pulses emanating from deep beneath the surface. Dr. Sarah Chen, a seismologist at the University of California, analyzed 5 years of Antarctic seismic data and found something that shouldn't exist. Mechanical vibrations occurring at precise intervals, always from the same underground locations. The signature was unmistakable to anyone familiar with industrial machinery or large-scale mechanical systems. When Chen tried to publish her analysis, she was contacted by representatives from the Department of Defense, who claimed her research had implications for national security. They didn't deny her findings. They didn't claim she was wrong. They simply informed her that certain discoveries were not appropriate for public release. Chen later described the encounter as surreal. These weren't scientists or academics trying to peer-review her work. They were intelligence operatives who seemed to know exactly what she had discovered and why it needed to be kept secret. They offered her a lucrative research position at a classified facility with the understanding that her Antarctic findings would never see publication. She turned down the offer and continued trying to publicize her discovery through alternative channels. Within months, her university position was eliminated due to budget constraints, and she found herself effectively blacklisted from academic institutions across the country. The message was clear. Some discoveries are too dangerous for public consumption, but why would seismic evidence of mechanical activity be considered a national security threat? The answer might lie in what that activity suggests about the current status of whatever's buried beneath the ice. Because if there are still active systems operating in Antarctica, systems that have been running for potentially thousands of years, then we're not just talking about archaeological artifacts anymore. We're talking about functional technology that operates on principles we don't understand, using power sources we can't identify, maintaining itself through mechanisms that challenge our basic understanding of physics and engineering. The thermal signatures detected by satellite become even more significant in this context. Those organized heat patterns aren't just residual warmth from ancient structures. They're evidence of systems that are still consuming energy, still generating heat, still operating according to their original programming or purpose. And that raises the most disturbing question of all. If these systems are still active after all this time, what are they doing down there? What function are they serving? And who, if anyone, is controlling them? The Antarctic Treaty, signed in 1959, was supposedly created to preserve the continent for peaceful scientific research. But look at the timing. This was right at the height of the Cold War, when both the United States and Soviet Union were desperately competing for technological advantages. The treaty effectively froze all military activity in Antarctica and established international oversight of any research conducted there. On the surface, it seems like a noble effort to keep the continent neutral, but consider another possibility. What if the treaty wasn't designed to prevent military activity, but to control access to something that had already been discovered? Something so significant that the world's superpowers agreed to cooperate rather than compete for control of it. The treaty gives veto power over research activities to any of the signatory nations. This means that if one country discovers something significant, the others can block any further investigation. It's a perfect mechanism for maintaining the status quo, while preventing any single nation from gaining an advantage from Antarctic discoveries. Recent amendments to the treaty have actually strengthened these restrictions. Environmental protection protocols now make it even more difficult for independent researchers to access sensitive areas of the continent. The bureaucratic barriers that once slowed down unwanted investigations have become nearly insurmountable walls. Meanwhile, military and intelligence agencies from treaty nations maintain a constant presence in Antarctica under the guise of logistical support for scientific missions. These facilities are officially off-limits to civilian researchers, and their activities are classified at the highest levels. The official explanation is that they're providing communications, transportation, and security services for legitimate scientific operations. But several former personnel have reported that much of the military activity in Antarctica has nothing to do with supporting civilian research. Instead, they describe ongoing monitoring and containment operations focused on specific underground locations. One former Navy communications specialist, speaking on condition of anonymity, described being stationed at what he was told was a weather monitoring facility in East Antarctica, but the equipment he maintained had nothing to do with meteorology. Instead, he worked on sophisticated detection and analysis systems designed to monitor subsurface activity. His job was to track and record any changes in underground conditions, particularly thermal and electromagnetic signatures that might indicate increased activity from whatever was buried beneath the ice. The data was transmitted directly to classified facilities in the United States, bypassing normal scientific channels entirely. When asked what kind of activity they were monitoring, he could only say that his superiors were clearly expecting something to happen, something significant enough to justify maintaining round-the-clock surveillance for years at a time. The pieces of this puzzle are starting to form a picture that's both fascinating and terrifying. Ancient structures that may still be functional. Systematic suppression of evidence by governments and institutions worldwide. Ongoing monitoring and containment operations disguised as scientific research. But there's one more piece of evidence that ties everything together, and it comes from the most unlikely source imaginable. The most unlikely source turned out to be Antarctica itself, because the ice has been talking, and what it's saying doesn't match the official story at all. Ice core samples are like time capsules, preserving atmospheric conditions and environmental data going back hundreds of thousands of years. They're one of the most reliable methods we have for understanding Earth's climate history. But when researchers started analyzing cores from specific regions of Antarctica, they found something that shouldn't exist, according to our current understanding of the continent's geological timeline. Dr. Marcus Webb, a climatologist who spent 15 years studying Antarctic ice cores, discovered atmospheric signatures that indicated periods of significantly warmer temperatures in regions that should have been frozen solid for millions of years. Not gradual warming cycles that might be explained by natural climate variation, but sudden temperature spikes that suggested massive heat sources beneath the ice. The data showed that certain areas of Antarctica experienced tropical level temperatures as recently as 11,000 years ago. Not just warmer than expected, but warm enough to support liquid water, vegetation, and potentially human habitation. The implications were staggering because it meant that large portions of the continent were ice-free during a period when advanced civilizations were developing around the world. Webb's findings aligned perfectly with geological evidence that other researchers had been quietly documenting for years. Fossilized plant remains found in areas that should never have supported vegetation. Sediment layers that indicated flowing rivers and lakes where only solid ice should exist. Mineral deposits that could only form in temperate climates. But here's what made Webb's discovery truly extraordinary. The warming events weren't random. They occurred in precise geographic patterns, concentrated around the same underground locations where satellites had detected unusual structures and thermal signatures, as if something beneath the ice was generating enough heat to create localized tropical microclimates in the middle of a frozen wasteland. When Webb tried to correlate his ice core data with the satellite imagery that had been leaked by other researchers, the patterns lined up with disturbing precision. Every major thermal anomaly detected from space corresponded to a location where ice cores showed evidence of artificial warming. The underground structures weren't just ancient buildings. They were massive heat sources that had been operating for thousands of years. The energy requirements for generating that much sustained heat would be enormous, far beyond anything achievable with conventional technology, even by today's standards. Whatever was powering these systems represented a level of engineering sophistication that mainstream science insists didn't exist in the ancient world. Webb documented everything meticulously, preparing what should have been the most significant climatological discovery of the century. But when he submitted his findings for peer review, he encountered the same wall of resistance that had stopped so many other researchers. His data was deemed inconclusive. His methodology was questioned despite years of successful ice core analysis, and his access to Antarctic research stations was quietly revoked. The message was clear. Some discoveries are too inconvenient for the established narrative of human history. But Webb wasn't the only one finding evidence that Antarctica's past was far more complex than official sources wanted to admit. Marine biologists studying the waters around the continent started reporting unusual findings that suggested recent geological activity in areas that should have been stable for millions of years. Ocean floor surveys revealed sediment patterns indicating major changes in underwater topography within the last 15,000 years. Not gradual shifts caused by tectonic movement, but sudden alterations that suggested massive structures had been exposed and then reburied by changing ice conditions. The seafloor around Antarctica told a story of dramatic environmental changes occurring on timescales that didn't fit conventional geological models. Even more intriguing were the biological discoveries. Species of deep-sea organisms found in Antarctic waters that appeared to be evolutionary descendants of creatures that lived in much warmer climates. The genetic analysis suggested these populations had been isolated in thermal refugia, warm water pockets that had persisted beneath the ice for thousands of years. The only known source of such sustained underwater heating would be geothermal vents, but the distribution of these warm water species didn't match any natural geothermal patterns. Instead, they clustered around the same coordinates where other researchers had detected artificial structures and unusual thermal signatures. Dr. Jennifer Liu, a marine biologist from the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution, spent 3 years studying these thermal refugia. She documented ecosystems that shouldn't exist, thriving in artificially heated waters beneath miles of ice. The biological evidence suggested that whatever was generating heat down there had been operating continuously for millennia, maintaining stable temperatures that allowed complex life forms to survive and evolve in isolation. Liu's research revealed something even more remarkable. Some of the organisms she discovered possessed genetic markers that didn't match any known evolutionary lineages. They appeared to be engineered rather than evolved, with biological characteristics that suggested deliberate modification for survival in extreme environments. When Liu tried to publish her findings, she was informed that her research had been classified by the National Science Foundation. The biological samples she had collected were confiscated, and her laboratory was placed under federal oversight. She was offered a position at a classified research facility where she could continue her work under government supervision with the understanding that her discoveries would never be made public. Like so many others before her, Liu found herself faced with an impossible choice: accept the silencing of her research or watch her career disappear entirely. She chose to speak out, and within months found herself unable to secure funding for any new research projects. The pattern was always the same. Researchers from different disciplines, working independently, kept discovering evidence that Antarctica harbored secrets far more significant than anyone was willing to admit publicly. And every time someone got close to connecting the pieces, the full weight of institutional authority came down to silence them. But perhaps the most damning evidence came from an unexpected source within the system itself. A leaked document from the Defense Intelligence Agency, dated 2017, contained references to ongoing containment operations at multiple Antarctic locations. The document described active monitoring of what it termed anomalous subsurface installations and discussed protocols for managing potential activation events. The language was deliberately vague, but the implications were clear. Military intelligence agencies knew about the underground structures. They had been monitoring them for years, and they were actively working to prevent whatever was down there from becoming more active than it already was. The document also referenced treaty compliance measures designed to prevent unauthorized investigation of sensitive sites. This confirmed what many researchers had suspected, that the Antarctic Treaty wasn't just about environmental protection or international cooperation. It was a mechanism for controlling access to discoveries that could fundamentally alter our understanding of human civilization and technological capability. But why would such discoveries be considered so threatening that they required this level of secrecy and suppression? The answer might lie in what these ancient technologies could reveal about the true capabilities of human civilization, both past and present. If there really are functional installations beneath the Antarctic ice, installations that have been operating for thousands of years using energy sources and engineering principles we don't understand, then studying them could revolutionize every field of science and technology. clean energy, advanced materials, construction techniques that could transform how we build and live. Such discoveries would also raise uncomfortable questions about human history itself. If ancient civilizations possessed technologies that we're only now rediscovering, what happened to that knowledge? Why did humanity apparently regress from advanced capabilities to primitive tools and techniques? And what other aspects of our past have been deliberately obscured or forgotten? These aren't just academic questions. They touch on fundamental assumptions about progress, development, and the trajectory of human civilization. If the standard narrative of gradual technological advancement is wrong, if there were periods of high technology followed by deliberate suppression or catastrophic loss, then much of what we believe about our own species would need to be reconsidered. For institutions that have built their authority on controlling the flow of information and maintaining particular versions of historical truth, such revelations would represent an existential threat. Universities, governments, religious organizations, and corporate interests all have invested heavily in specific interpretations of human development and capability. The discovery of advanced ancient technologies would undermine the credibility of these institutions while potentially destabilizing the economic and political systems they support. If revolutionary technologies existed in the past and are still functional today, who should control access to them? Who gets to decide how they're studied, developed, and implemented? These are the kinds of questions that keep people in power awake at night. Because once certain information becomes public, it becomes impossible to control how that information is used or who benefits from it. The safest approach, from an institutional perspective, is to ensure that such information never becomes public in the first place. The evidence suggests that's exactly what's been happening in Antarctica for decades. A coordinated effort to suppress discoveries that could transform human understanding of technology, history, and our own capabilities as a species. The researchers who've spoken out have described a system that operates with ruthless efficiency, using everything from bureaucratic obstruction to professional assassination to maintain control over information deemed too sensitive for public release. But the most chilling aspect of this suppression isn't what it reveals about government secrecy or institutional corruption. It's what it suggests about the nature of the discoveries themselves. Because the level of resources and coordination required to maintain this kind of cover-up indicates that whatever's buried beneath the Antarctic ice is considered extraordinarily significant by those in power. Significant enough to justify careers destroyed, research buried, and evidence systematically erased from the public record. Significant enough to maintain round-the-clock monitoring operations disguised as scientific research. Significant enough to reshape international treaties and create new levels of classification for information that officially doesn't exist. The question is no longer whether there are ancient structures beneath the Antarctic ice. The evidence for that is overwhelming, despite the systematic efforts to suppress it. The question is what those structures represent, what they're still doing down there, and why the revelation of their existence is considered such a threat to the established order. The answers to those questions might be buried under miles of ice, but the pattern of suppression surrounding them tells its own story. A story about power, control, and the lengths to which institutions will go to maintain their version of reality, even when that reality is built on lies, omissions, and the systematic silencing of inconvenient truths. And if the researchers who've risked everything to speak out are correct, we're looking at evidence of technologies and capabilities that could transform human civilization overnight. Technologies that have been deliberately kept from public knowledge, while those in power decide how, when, and if humanity will ever be allowed to benefit from its own hidden heritage. The ice is melting, slowly but inevitably. And with it, The secrets that have been buried for so long may finally see the light of day. The question is whether those who've worked so hard to keep these discoveries hidden will find a way to maintain their control when the truth finally emerges from beneath the endless white expanse of Antarctica. The truth about what lies beneath Antarctica might be closer to the surface than anyone realizes, because while governments and institutions have worked tirelessly to suppress evidence of ancient structures, they couldn't stop the ice itself from revealing their secrets. And what it's showing us suggests that the cover-up isn't just about protecting archaeological discoveries. It's about hiding something that's still very much alive. In 2020, a commercial weather satellite captured thermal imagery that should have been routine data for climate monitoring. Instead, it revealed heat signatures beneath the Antarctic ice that defied every natural explanation. Not the scattered patterns you'd expect from geothermal activity, but organized geometric formations that looked like circuitry, vast networks of interconnected pathways, all generating heat in precise, coordinated patterns. The satellite operator who first analyzed the data later described it as looking like a massive electronic system viewed from above. Rectangular sections connected by linear corridors, with junction points that pulsed with higher temperatures in regular intervals, as if something down there was processing information, routing energy, operating according to a complex internal logic that had been running uninterrupted for thousands of years. Within hours of the discovery, the data was classified and the original analyst was reassigned to a different project. The official explanation was that the thermal readings represented a previously unknown type of volcanic activity, but volcanoes don't organize themselves into neat geometric patterns, and they certainly don't pulse with the rhythmic precision of a heartbeat. Dr. Robert Hayes, a former NASA thermal imaging specialist who saw the original data before it was classified, later described what he witnessed in terms that still send chills down my spine. It looked like a city, he said. Not just buildings, but an entire infrastructure. Power grids, transportation networks, processing centers. All of it generating heat signatures that suggested massive energy consumption. Hayes tried to analyze the data further, but his access was revoked before he could complete his assessment. When he persisted in asking questions about the thermal anomalies, he was informed that his security clearance had been suspended pending a review that never came. His career at NASA ended abruptly, and he found himself effectively blacklisted from any position requiring government security clearance. But Hayes wasn't the only one who saw the data. Before it was fully classified, fragments of the thermal imagery leaked to researchers at universities around the world, and what they found when they analyzed those fragments confirmed Hayes's initial assessment. The heat signatures weren't random. They followed patterns that suggested artificial construction on a scale that dwarfed any human engineering project in recorded history. Dr. Patricia Vance, a thermal dynamics expert at MIT, managed to analyze several gigabytes of the leaked data before it was scrubbed from academic servers. Her preliminary analysis revealed heat generation that would require energy sources producing the equivalent of several nuclear power plants running continuously. But the distribution of that energy followed patterns that no known technology could explain. The thermal gradients were perfectly controlled, Vance explained in a private interview. You had areas generating temperatures of over 100 degrees Fahrenheit, connected by corridors maintaining exactly 72 degrees, feeding into junction points that held steady at precisely 85 degrees. That level of thermal control requires technology that we can barely achieve today, much less something that's been operating autonomously for millennia. Vance's analysis also revealed something that challenged basic physics as we understand it. The heat sources appeared to be generating more energy than they were consuming. The thermal output exceeded any reasonable estimate of geothermal input, suggesting that whatever was down there had access to energy generation principles that mainstream science considers impossible. When Vance tried to publish her findings, she encountered the same wall of institutional resistance that had silenced so many others. Her research was deemed classified retroactively, meaning that work she had already completed was suddenly considered a national security risk. Her laboratory was placed under federal oversight, and she was ordered to surrender all copies of her analysis. But by then, it was too late to contain the story completely. Word of the thermal anomalies had spread through the international research community, sparking interest from scientists who weren't bound by American security restrictions. Russian, Chinese, and European researchers began conducting their own analysis of Antarctic thermal patterns using data from their own satellite networks. What they found confirmed that the heat signatures weren't isolated to a single location. Similar thermal patterns appeared across multiple regions of Antarctica, suggesting a network of connected installations spanning thousands of square miles beneath the ice. Each site showed the same characteristics: organized heat distribution, rhythmic pulsing patterns, and energy output that exceeded any natural explanation. The Chinese Academy of Sciences published a preliminary report suggesting that the thermal anomalies represented infrastructure of unknown origin operating at unprecedented efficiency levels. The report was quickly retracted after diplomatic pressure from the United States, but not before it had been downloaded by researchers around the world. The Russian Academy went further, publishing detailed thermal maps showing what they termed technothermal signatures across East Antarctica. Their analysis suggested that the underground installations were not only active, but appeared to be expanding their thermal footprint over time, as if whatever was down there was growing or building new components. These international findings put enormous pressure on American institutions to provide explanations for the thermal anomalies. But instead of transparency, the response was an unprecedented level of classification and information control. The thermal data became subject to the highest levels of security restriction, and any research touching on Antarctic thermal patterns was automatically classified as sensitive. Meanwhile, the military presence in Antarctica began to expand dramatically. What had been small support operations for scientific missions became major logistical installations with capabilities far exceeding anything needed for civilian research. Cargo flights to Antarctica increased by over 300% between 2020 and 2022, carrying equipment and personnel for operations that were never publicly acknowledged. Former military personnel who worked on these expanded operations describe a sense of urgency that had nothing to do with supporting scientific research. They were told they were participating in containment and monitoring missions, but the nature of what they were containing was never explained. They worked with equipment designed for deep ice penetration, underground surveillance, and something they were only told was thermal management. One former Army Corps of Engineers officer, speaking anonymously, described being deployed to install what he was told were environmental monitoring stations at specific coordinates in East Antarctica. But the equipment he installed had nothing to do with weather monitoring. Instead, he worked with sophisticated sensor arrays designed to detect and measure subsurface activity. "We were basically building a surveillance network," he explained. Sensors positioned at precise intervals across the ice, all feeding data back to a central command facility that wasn't officially supposed to exist. The whole operation felt like we were watching something, waiting for it to do something specific. When asked what kind of activity they were monitoring for, the officer could only say that his superiors seemed genuinely worried about changes in underground conditions. The sensor network was designed to detect increases in thermal output, structural movement, and electromagnetic emissions from beneath the ice, as if whatever was down there might suddenly become more active, and they wanted advance warning when that happened. The electromagnetic monitoring is particularly significant because it suggests that the underground installations aren't just generating heat. They're producing organized electromagnetic signals that can be detected from the surface. Radio frequencies, magnetic field variations, and electrical activity that follows patterns too regular to be natural. Dr. Amanda Foster, an electromagnetic specialist who analyzed leaked data from the monitoring network, described signals that resembled sophisticated communication systems. Not random electromagnetic noise, but organized transmissions following protocols that suggested advanced digital encoding, as if the underground installations were communicating with each other across vast distances beneath the ice. The signal patterns were incredibly complex, Foster explained. Multiple frequency bands carrying different types of information, all synchronized with the thermal pulsing we detected in satellite imagery. It looked like a massive computer network, processing and sharing information between different nodes across the continent. Foster's analysis suggested that the electromagnetic activity was increasing over time, with more complex signal patterns appearing in recent years. Whatever was generating these transmissions seemed to be becoming more sophisticated, more active, possibly responding to changes in external conditions or following some kind of internal development program. The implications were staggering. If Foster's analysis was correct, the underground installations weren't just ancient ruins preserving obsolete technology. They were active systems that had been continuously evolving, upgrading themselves, possibly preparing for something that required increasingly complex coordination between different sites. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the electromagnetic monitoring was what it revealed about the scope of the underground network. The signals weren't confined to a few isolated locations. They formed a web spanning the entire continent, with major transmission nodes connected by communication links that suggested a unified system operating as a single, massive entity. This wasn't just archaeological evidence of an ancient civilization. It was proof of an active technological presence that had been operating beneath Antarctica for thousands of years, continuously developing and expanding its capabilities while remaining completely hidden from human awareness. The realization that something of this magnitude had been operating undetected for so long raised questions that no one in positions of authority seemed willing to address. If these systems were so advanced, so sophisticated, what was their purpose? What had they been doing all this time? And why, after millennia of hidden operation, did their activity levels seem to be increasing? The answers to these questions might explain the unprecedented level of secrecy surrounding Antarctic research. Because if there really were active technological systems beneath the ice, systems that appeared to be preparing for something, then the implications extended far beyond archaeological curiosity. We might be looking at evidence of an intelligence that had never stopped operating, never stopped developing, never stopped watching and waiting for the right moment to reveal itself to the world above. And if the recent increases in thermal and electromagnetic activity were any indication, that moment might be approaching faster than anyone was prepared to acknowledge. The systematic suppression of evidence, the military build-up, the international cooperation in maintaining secrecy, all of it made sense if viewed through this lens. Those in power weren't just hiding archaeological discoveries. They were trying to manage humanity's first contact with an intelligence that had been sharing our planet all along, hidden beneath miles of ice, quietly preparing for a revelation that could change everything we thought we knew about our place in the universe. But the ice doesn't keep secrets forever, and as global warming continues to thin the Antarctic ice sheet, whatever lies beneath is getting closer to the surface with each passing year. The question isn't whether these hidden installations will eventually be exposed. The question is whether those who've worked so hard to keep them secret will be able to control the narrative when that exposure finally occurs. Because once the world sees clear evidence of advanced technology operating beneath the Antarctic ice, technology that predates and surpasses our own capabilities, every assumption about human history, technological development, and our planet's past will need to be reconsidered. And that kind of paradigm shift has always been exactly what those in power fear most. The melting ice isn't just revealing ancient artifacts. It's counting down to a moment of revelation that could transform human understanding of reality itself. And based on the increasing activity detected by monitoring systems, that countdown might be approaching its final stages. The countdown seems to be accelerating, because what happened next defied every protocol, every contingency plan, every carefully constructed narrative that governments had spent decades perfecting. In March of 2023, something changed beneath the Antarctic ice, and this time, there was no way to hide it. It started with the seismic monitors, the same network of sensors that had been quietly tracking underground activity for years, suddenly lit up with readings that shouldn't have been possible. Not earthquakes or tectonic shifts, but rhythmic pulses emanating from dozens of locations simultaneously across the continent, all synchronized, all increasing in intensity, all following a pattern that suggested deliberate coordination. Dr. Catherine Morris, a seismologist at the University of Alaska who had been monitoring the Antarctic data feed, watched in real time as the underground installations appeared to activate in sequence. First, the sites in East Antarctica, then the installations beneath the Transantarctic Mountains, finally, the massive thermal signatures in West Antarctica, like a vast machine coming online after centuries of dormancy. It was like watching a city wake up, Morris later described in a leaked interview. One by one, systems that had been running at minimal power suddenly surged to full capacity. The seismic signatures showed mechanical movement on a scale I'd never seen before. Massive structures shifting, rotating, emerging from depths that should have been solid ice for millions of years. Within hours, the thermal satellite data confirmed what the seismic monitors were detecting. Heat signatures that had remained stable for decades suddenly spiked to levels that created visible effects on the surface ice. Localized melting patterns that revealed geometric shapes beneath the ice sheet, shapes that were unmistakably artificial, unmistakably massive, and unmistakably active. The response from official channels was immediate and unprecedented. All civilian access to Antarctic seismic and thermal data was suspended indefinitely. Research stations across the continent were placed under military control. International flights to Antarctica were grounded without explanation, and a media blackout descended over the entire continent that was more complete than anything seen since the height of the Cold War. But this time, the cover-up couldn't hold, because what was happening beneath the ice was creating effects that were visible from space, detectable by commercial satellites, impossible to explain away as natural phenomena. The geometric melting patterns appeared on publicly available satellite imagery. The synchronized seismic pulses were recorded by monitoring stations around the world. The electromagnetic signatures were picked up by amateur radio operators across the southern hemisphere. The Antarctic Anomaly Project, the group of independent researchers who had been documenting evidence suppression for years, suddenly found themselves with more data than they could process. Thermal imagery showing massive structures breaching the surface ice. Electromagnetic recordings of complex signal patterns that resembled nothing in any technical database. Seismic data indicating mechanical activity on a scale that dwarfed the largest human engineering projects. Maria Santos, the project's lead coordinator, realized they were witnessing something that would be impossible to suppress or dismiss. We weren't looking at archaeological evidence anymore. she explained. We were watching active technology that had decided to reveal itself. The question wasn't whether it existed, but what it wanted us to know. The electromagnetic signals were the key to understanding what was happening. Dr. Amanda Foster, working with a team of cryptographers and signal analysts, began decoding the transmissions emanating from the underground installations. What they found was a communication protocol of staggering sophistication, encoding information in multiple layers that suggested intelligence far exceeding current human capabilities. The signals weren't random or chaotic. They followed mathematical patterns that incorporated prime number sequences, geometric constants, and physical equations that described fundamental forces of the universe. It was a language designed to be understood by any intelligence capable of advanced mathematics and physics. A universal communication protocol that transcended cultural or technological barriers. But the most remarkable aspect of the transmissions wasn't their sophistication, it was their content. Because when Foster's team finally cracked the basic encoding structure, they realized the signals weren't just random communications between underground installations. They were messages directed toward the surface world, toward humanity. The initial decoded transmissions were simple but profound. Mathematical proofs demonstrating the existence of the underground intelligence, diagrams showing the layout and capabilities of the hidden installations. And something that sent chills through everyone who saw it, detailed maps of human civilization showing population centers, technological capabilities, and resource distributions with accuracy that could only come from continuous, long-term observation. Whatever was beneath the ice hadn't been dormant or isolated. It had been watching, learning, cataloging human development and capabilities for centuries, possibly millennia. And now it was ready to make contact. The leaked transmissions created an immediate crisis within intelligence communities worldwide, because the underground installations weren't just revealing their existence. They were demonstrating capabilities that made human military technology look primitive by comparison. Energy generation systems that violated known physics. Materials science that enabled construction projects spanning continents. Communication networks that operated faster than light itself. General Patricia Hayes, who served as liaison between the Pentagon and Antarctic operations, later described the moment when military analysts realized the scope of what they were dealing with. We weren't looking at an archaeological site or even advanced ancient technology, she said in classified testimony that was later leaked. We were facing an active intelligence that had capabilities we couldn't match, couldn't counter, and couldn't understand. Everything we thought we knew about technological supremacy became irrelevant overnight. The military response was swift, but ultimately futile. Emergency protocols were activated to establish containment around the most active sites. Advanced sensor networks were deployed to monitor underground activity. Electromagnetic jamming systems were positioned to disrupt the alien communications. None of it worked. The installations beneath the ice operated on principles that made conventional countermeasures useless. Jamming attempts were effortlessly circumvented. Seismic monitoring revealed that the underground structures were expanding rapidly, with new construction occurring at impossible speeds, using techniques that left no trace of how they were accomplished. And the communications continued, becoming more complex and more direct with each passing day. By April 2023, the decoded messages had evolved beyond simple identification protocols. The underground intelligence began transmitting detailed information about human history, filling in gaps that mainstream archaeology had never been able to explain. Construction techniques for megalithic structures. Navigation methods that enabled prehistoric ocean voyages. Agricultural innovations that allowed civilization to flourish in harsh environments. It was providing answers to questions that had puzzled researchers for centuries. But more than that, It was revealing that human civilization had developed under guidance that was never acknowledged in historical records. The underground intelligence hadn't just been watching human development. It had been influencing it, directing it, preparing humanity for a moment of revelation that had finally arrived. The implications were staggering and terrifying. If this intelligence had been guiding human civilization for millennia, then everything about human history, human achievement, human destiny was fundamentally different from what we had believed. We weren't the dominant intelligence on our planet. We were students who had finally advanced enough to meet our teachers face to face. But the most disturbing revelation was yet to come, because as Foster's team decoded more complex transmissions, they began to understand the timeline the underground intelligence was operating on. The recent activation wasn't random or coincidental. It was a response to specific conditions that had been developing for decades. Environmental changes, technological developments, social and political trends that indicated humanity was approaching a critical juncture in its development. The intelligence beneath the ice had been waiting for humanity to reach a specific threshold. Not just technological capability, but something more fundamental, a level of global interconnectedness, environmental awareness, and existential threat that would make humanity ready for the next phase of its development. And according to their calculations, that threshold had been reached. The transmissions began including countdown sequences, not threats or ultimatums, but schedules, timetables for events that would fundamentally alter the relationship between human civilization and the intelligence that had been hidden beneath Antarctica for so long. The ice was melting rapidly around the most active sites, revealing structures that defied every assumption about ancient capabilities and current possibilities. Government officials around the world found themselves facing a choice that no contingency planning had ever anticipated. They could continue trying to suppress evidence of something that was becoming impossible to hide, or they could begin preparing humanity for revelations that would change everything about how we understand our place in the universe. The decision wasn't made in boardrooms or cabinet meetings. It was made for them by the intelligence beneath the ice, which began broadcasting its signals on frequencies that commercial receivers could detect. Amateur radio operators, satellite tracking enthusiasts, and electronics hobbyists around the world started picking up transmissions that contained mathematical proofs, engineering diagrams, and philosophical concepts that clearly originated from a non-human source. The cover-up that had lasted for decades crumbled in a matter of weeks, not through investigative journalism or whistleblower revelations, but through direct communication from an intelligence that had decided humanity was ready to know the truth. The Antarctic installations weren't just revealing their existence. They were introducing themselves to a species that had finally developed enough to understand what they had to offer. But understanding and accepting are two different things, because what the underground intelligence was offering wasn't just advanced technology or historical knowledge. It was partnership in a development program that had been running for thousands of years, with goals that extended far beyond anything human civilization had ever contemplated. The messages made it clear that Earth wasn't an isolated planet developing in cosmic solitude. It was part of a network of worlds where intelligence was cultivated, guided, and eventually integrated into something larger. The underground installations weren't just remnants of an ancient civilization. They were outposts of a galactic community that humanity was being invited to join. The countdown in the transmissions wasn't marking the end of secrecy. It was marking the beginning of humanity's graduation to a level of existence that would make everything we thought we understood about reality seem like childhood memories. The ice was melting, the installations were activating, and the teachers who had been waiting patiently beneath Antarctica for millennia were finally ready to step forward and show their students what came next. But first, Humanity would have to prove it was ready for lessons that would challenge every assumption about consciousness, technology, and the nature of existence itself. The underground intelligence had been preparing for this moment longer than human civilization had existed. The question was whether we had been preparing well enough to meet them as equals, rather than simply advanced primates who had finally learned to use tools. The thermal signatures beneath the ice continued to intensify. The electromagnetic transmissions became more frequent and more complex. And somewhere in the depths of Antarctica, ancient machinery hummed to life with purposes that would soon reshape everything humanity thought it knew about its past, its present, and its future among the stars. The revelation was no longer coming, it was here, and there was nowhere left to hide from truths that had been waiting beneath the ice for longer than recorded history could remember. The morning of the 15th of June, 2023, changed everything, not because of any government announcement or media revelation, but because people around the world woke up to something that couldn't be explained away or classified into silence. The sky above Antarctica was glowing. Amateur astronomers first noticed it, a faint aurora-like phenomenon visible even during daylight hours, stretching across the horizon above the southern continent. But this wasn't the familiar green and blue curtains of the northern or southern lights. This was something entirely different. Structured geometric patterns of light that pulsed in perfect synchronization with the seismic activity detected beneath the ice. The light patterns were visible from satellite imagery, impossible to dismiss or digitally alter without raising more questions than answers. Social media exploded with videos and photographs from the southern hemisphere showing organized displays of luminescence that followed mathematical sequences. The same prime number patterns and geometric constants that had appeared in the decoded transmissions were now being projected into the atmosphere above Antarctica. Dr. James Richardson, an atmospheric physicist at the Australian National University, was among the first to realize what they were witnessing. The luminous displays weren't being generated in the atmosphere, he explained in an emergency conference call with colleagues worldwide. They were being projected from beneath the ice sheet, using energy levels that should have been impossible to achieve without detection by every monitoring system on the planet. Richardson's analysis of the light patterns revealed something that sent shockwaves through the scientific community. The geometric displays weren't random or decorative, they were functional. Each pattern corresponded to specific electromagnetic frequencies that were having measurable effects on global communication systems, weather patterns, and even the planet's magnetic field. Satellites began malfunctioning as they passed over Antarctica. Not random failures, but systematic modifications that improved their performance in ways that human technology couldn't achieve. GPS systems became more accurate. Communication networks experienced enhanced signal clarity. Weather monitoring equipment started providing data with unprecedented precision. The underground intelligence wasn't just announcing its presence, it was demonstrating its capabilities by upgrading human technology in real time, from a distance, using principles that mainstream science insisted were impossible. But the most significant change wasn't technological, it was psychological. Because as the light displays became more frequent and more complex, people around the world began experiencing something that psychiatrists and neurologists struggled to explain. Enhanced pattern recognition, improved mathematical intuition, sudden insights into problems that had seemed unsolvable just days before. Dr. Sarah Chen, a neuroscientist at Stanford, documented cases of individuals with no advanced mathematical training suddenly understanding complex equations after exposure to imagery of the Antarctic light displays. It wasn't learning in any traditional sense, she noted. It was more like remembering something they had always known but couldn't access until the right trigger activated dormant neural pathways. The phenomenon spread rapidly through social media as people shared videos and photographs of the light patterns. Viewers reported similar cognitive enhancements, sudden clarity about scientific concepts, artistic insights, and problem-solving abilities they had never possessed before. As if the geometric displays were somehow upgrading human consciousness itself. Intelligence agencies around the world found themselves dealing with a crisis they had never anticipated. The information they had worked so hard to suppress was now being transmitted directly into people's minds through visual exposure to the Antarctic phenomena. Classified concepts about physics, engineering, and consciousness were becoming common knowledge among anyone who spent time studying the light patterns. Military installations reported that personnel exposed to the imagery began demonstrating enhanced technical abilities, improved strategic thinking, and most disturbing of all, reduced responsiveness to traditional command structures. Soldiers who had viewed the light displays started questioning orders that didn't align with broader humanitarian objectives, as if their expanded awareness made them incapable of participating in activities that served narrow institutional interests. The underground intelligence wasn't just revealing advanced technology. It was activating dormant potentials within human consciousness that made traditional forms of control and manipulation increasingly ineffective. People who experienced the cognitive enhancements became more cooperative, more creative, more focused on long-term collective benefits rather than short-term individual gains. Governments faced a dilemma that no contingency planning had ever addressed. They could try to restrict access to imagery of the Antarctic phenomena, but doing so would only confirm that the light displays were having real effects on human consciousness. They could continue denying the significance of what was happening, but the evidence was becoming visible to anyone with internet access and basic observation skills. Meanwhile, the installations beneath the ice continued expanding their activities. New sites activated across the continent, each one contributing to the growing network of energy projection and consciousness enhancement. The thermal signatures became so intense that localized weather systems began forming above the most active locations, creating cloud formations that followed the same geometric patterns as the light displays. Dr. Michael Torres, a meteorologist who had been tracking Antarctic weather anomalies, realized that the underground installations were beginning to influence global climate systems. They weren't causing random disruption, he observed. They were fine-tuning atmospheric conditions to optimize the transmission and reception of whatever signals they were broadcasting into human consciousness. The weather modifications were subtle but significant. Cloud formations that enhanced the visibility of the light displays, atmospheric conditions that improved the propagation of the electromagnetic frequencies associated with cognitive enhancement, temperature and pressure adjustments that seemed designed to make the effects of exposure more pronounced and longer-lasting. By July 2023, it became impossible for anyone to ignore what was happening. The Antarctic installations weren't just active, they were actively transforming human consciousness on a global scale. Educational institutions reported that students were advancing through curriculum at unprecedented rates. Research facilities documented breakthrough discoveries occurring simultaneously across multiple disciplines. Creative industries experienced an explosion of innovation that defied statistical probability. But the most significant changes were social and political. Communities exposed to the Antarctic phenomena began organizing themselves differently. Traditional hierarchies based on authority and control gave way to collaborative networks focused on collective problem-solving. Economic systems based on competition and scarcity evolved toward cooperation and resource optimization. The consciousness enhancements weren't just making people smarter, they were making them more aware of their interconnectedness, more capable of thinking in terms of planetary rather than tribal interests. more focused on long-term sustainability rather than short-term exploitation. Government officials found themselves dealing with populations that were becoming increasingly difficult to manipulate through traditional propaganda and fear-based messaging. People enhanced by exposure to the Antarctic phenomena could see through deception more easily, recognize logical fallacies more quickly, and organize resistance to policies that didn't serve genuine collective interests. The patterns beneath the ice are no longer hidden, and the consciousness shifts occurring worldwide can no longer be ignored. What started as mysterious geometric formations in satellite imagery has become humanity's introduction to teachers who have been waiting patiently for us to develop enough awareness to join a larger cosmic community. The installations aren't just ancient ruins or advanced technology, they're graduation protocols designed to activate dormant potentials that make us capable of participating in something far greater than anything we previously imagined possible. Human civilization stands at the threshold of its greatest transformation, guided by an intelligence that has been nurturing our development from beneath the ice for thousands of years, finally revealing itself because we've reached the moment when we can understand what comes next in our species' extraordinary journey among the stars.